What a pleasure it is. I'm going to introduce Dave Tobis and hope that he will, during the course of the presentation, introduce his colleagues. As is now perfectly apparent, Dave and I went to high school together in Port Washington, New York. He went on to have an extraordinary career, as he hinted at today, in civil rights and the anti-war movement. He spent time working in child welfare, frankly, most of the rest of his life, as executive director of the Child Welfare Fund in New York City. Those experiences led to a book that he wrote called From Pariahs to Partners. Most recently, Dave has helped form the International Parent Advocacy Network, founded in 2018, and he is vice president. But all of that pales in comparison to the fact that when we graduated from high school, Dave was voted most versatile. And there he is carrying athletic equipment, books, and all the rest. I may have told Dave this, but he really has had a powerful influence on my life. Many of you know I converted to Judaism. I was a lapsed Catholic. It didn't connect with me, and I've often told the story as follows, that I had a lot of Jewish friends in high school. And I move on in telling my story without getting into details about those friends. But actually, several, Dave Tobis being the one I'm focusing on, but Jeff Futter and others in our class, what they did, and this happens in life, sometimes it is through personal relationships that you are exposed to other ways of thinking and other disciplines or ideas. And I had such respect for Dave and Jeff and other Jews that I met in high school that it simply opened up the possibility of Judaism as a choice. It took a little longer in my path to get to college, meet a Jewish girl, get married, convert to Judaism, and raise my kids Jewish. But I want Dave to know, and by extension, each of you, that you have influences on people in your lives that may never be known to you. And it's a blessing to be able to acknowledge inspiring people in your life. And one reason I invited Dave to join us beyond what I think is going to be a wonderful presentation is really to acknowledge that in you, Dave. And I'm so happy to turn this program over to you.
Thanks very much, Steve. I'm very touched by your words. It's a pleasure to be here with so many people that are involved in justice and reform activities, and particularly so many people who were involved, connected with Scotland. The founding of the International Parent Advocacy Network took place in Scotland in 2018 with people from several different countries, parents and their allies. The presentation today is going to be in several parts. To begin with, I'm going to talk about some of the misconceptions about the child welfare system, and then talk about how parents have organized to fight back, to try to improve the system and for them to have some voice and justice in the system. And then talk about how the movement of parents in New York has now spread to other countries. And then Sabra Jackson, who was part of the original parent advocacy movement in New York in the 1990s, is going to talk about her experience having had a child removed from her care and placed into foster care, and how she has fought back to try to improve the system in New York and elsewhere. And Taliah Drayak is going to talk about her experiences in child welfare, also having lost a child and having grown up in foster care herself. Through that experience, we're going to then talk about ways that you might be involved in supporting parents and families to have more justice in the child welfare system. Each of us will talk about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll circle back to see if there are ways that you can be involved. So to start with a discussion about people's conception of child welfare. Most people think of the child welfare system as a system that is designed to help and protect children, to make sure they're safe from parents who abuse them. We have a vast system of mandated reporting where people are required to report any suspected abuse and neglect. Doctors, social workers, teachers, nurses are all required by law to report any suspected situation of abuse or neglect. And then if the child is investigated and there was abuse or neglect, the child is removed and put into foster care where they're supposedly safe. This is a romanticized version of the child welfare system. I think the actual operation is much different. Of course, there are outstanding foster parents, and some children need to be in foster care and are protected there. But the system harms as many children and breaks up as many families as it does help them. And I want to give some facts about that. The rate of death from abuse is higher for children in foster care than for children in the general population. There's a 42% increase of your chance of death if you're in foster care from abuse than if you're in the general population. The rate of death from abuse in the general population has increased. In 1998, 3.3 children died from abuse every day. By 2018, 4.85 children died from abuse. So the system that's designed to protect children is not protecting them. And the rate of abuse and neglect in the general population has also been increasing until the pandemic. We're not sure about what's been happening during the pandemic, but the system designed to protect children is not doing that. In fact, there are 260,000 children who are removed from their families every year in the United States. And the vast majority of those children are removed for reasons of neglect, not for reasons of abuse. What you read about in the press are the most egregious stories of abuse. And that's the image people have about the child welfare system, that these are horrible parents, when in fact, most of the cases are because of neglect, which is often confused with poverty. The majority of people in the child welfare system are poor and people of color. And it's also a racist system. In Los Angeles, 9% of the population is Black. 40% of the children in foster care from Los Angeles are Black. And it's the same kind of disproportionality across the United States. There was a study done by Magruder and Shaw. Magruder is based in University of California at Berkeley. And he looked at a cohort of children who were born in 1997 and followed them till their 8th birthday, and found that among Black children, 38% have been investigated for abuse or neglect by the time the child is 8 years old. Wow. And what's more upsetting than that is that only 18% of those children across the country are found to actually have been abused or neglected. So you have a system of intrusion into families' homes that is as much a system of social control as it is a system of remediation and support. In this system, parents have had no voice, no say, rarely on their own case, and nothing in terms of shaping policy or in running or being involved in programs to help parents with what they need to identify what kinds of support would be helpful, until the 1990s in New York City. Prior to the 1990s, parents had no voice in child welfare, and they never organized as a force to bring about change. Parents had organized to help their children in other social welfare systems. Parents were very active in developmental disabilities and helped close down the Willowbrook Training Center, which was a snake pit for children with disabilities. Parents were active in mental health and education. Even in welfare, parents organized, but they had never organized in child welfare to be a force for change until the 1990s in New York City. New York City at that time, in 1992, had one of the worst child welfare systems in the country. There were 50,000 children, almost 50,000 children in foster care in New York City, in one city. There were 20 class action lawsuits filed against the city and the voluntary agencies for failing to protect children, for harming families. One of the worst problems was that when a child was found to have been abused or neglected, in 40% of the cases, nothing was done to help the child or the family. The family got no assistance, and the child was not removed until the situation exploded. It was in this context that parents organized for the first time to fight back. They organized with their allies, and I was one of their allies. As Steve mentioned, I ran the Child Welfare Fund. I had the good fortune to have a friend who inherited a significant amount of money, and the requirement of the will was that she give the money away, and she asked me to give it away with her. And we decided to focus on child welfare and created the Child Welfare Fund. And I'd contact somebody and say, do you have ideas of how you could help the child welfare system support parents? And I could give you $25,000 or $50,000. And generally people said, yes, I'd be happy to help out. And that led to and seeded a movement of parents and their allies doing lots of things to train parents to be leaders, to have parents tell their stories. They wrote what their experience had been and their recommendations in a publication called Rise Magazine. They spoke in schools of social work and law schools to help train the next generation, to have the perspective of parents presented. And they worked to help other parents who were going through what they went through so that they could be reunited with their children more quickly. One of the dramatic changes that came about from these parents working with their allies, pressuring the system to change, is that the number of children in foster care in New York, which had been almost 50,000 in 1992, is now fewer than 8,000. It's an extraordinary change in a system that moves at a glacier's pace. And there are other important changes that parents were able to help bring about. They now have exemplary legal representation, where previously parents had terrible legal representation when they were about to lose their child. They were represented by lawyers who weren't trained in child welfare, who were paid very little, who had no backup support, and who met their clients on the day of the court proceedings. So as a result, in almost every case, the child was removed and the parents' rights, I think, were trampled on. In the United States, there are 6 states that don't even provide lawyers for parents when they're about to lose their child. somebody who is found drunk on the streets has more rights to legal representation than a mother or father who's about to lose their child. Through this movement, not only did the number of kids in care decrease, legal representation came about, more services were provided to families so that they could remain safely with their children and not have the child removed, and parents began to have a voice in the system. There is an advisory council to the commissioner. Parents get to speak at legislative hearings, various settings. It's just the beginning, but parents are beginning to have a voice. And the example of New York City has spread to other parts of the United States and to other high-income countries. There are now over 100 programs in a dozen countries where parents who have had children removed are fighting back to help other parents so that they don't have to experience the trauma that they experienced. There's a group of grandmothers against removal, Aboriginal mothers in Australia who are grandmothers who are fighting to keep their grandchildren in their communities. Governments have also taken up this challenge to have parents have a voice. In England, there are 5 local authorities that have created parent advocacy programs where parents are trained to help other parents and where they're involved in advising the heads of the local authority on what policies would be most helpful for families. And through the work of the International Parent Advocacy Network, we are trying to support and help these fledgling groups that are just starting so that parents have rights and a voice. The International Parent Advocacy Network is a broad group. It's ethnically diverse. We have Maori and Aboriginal and First Nation and Asian American and Africans and African Americans and Latinos, all working with Caucasians and allies. The organization, our requirement is that more than half of the board of directors have to be parents with lived child welfare experience. And 2 of those extraordinary parents are here with us today. I want to introduce both of them who are going to speak next. Sabra Jackson was one of the founding members of the Child Welfare Organizing Project. She helped develop the training program to train parents who have been through the child welfare system. Because her efficacy in this non-governmental organization and her importance of her voice, she was hired by the city to be an advocate to work within city government to support parents. And Taliah Drayak, I imagine she'll tell you her story too, but extraordinarily, she grew up in foster care herself. I believe she was in 32 different foster placements. It's just a horrendous experience that she has survived so miraculously and is such a triumphant person. She had her own child placed into foster care, which she'll tell about, and is now one of the most powerful voices throughout the United Kingdom working on behalf of parents. After they speak, we'll make some suggestions about what can be done by you to help support parents and families, and then have plenty of time for questions. So Sabra, could you
Good morning, everybody. I'm Sabra Jackson, and this is absolutely a privilege to speak with partner with both of my colleagues, David and Taliah. So as David referenced, I'm going to kind of work backwards. I am the parent engagement specialist, which was recently appointed by the New York City Administration for Children's Services Commissioner David Hansel. I have the privilege of overseeing an advisory council at the Administration for Children's Services, which is made up of 21 parent advocates who advise the administration on policy, practice, and implementation around the family voice in New York City. This is a historical role that I have. This is the first time in the history of ACS, or the child welfare, that someone is in a leadership role, as many would say in the movement, or on the inside to help advise administration on policy, practice, and implementation. So I take that role very seriously, and I say that it is historical because, as David and Taliah know, it is historical. But my journey didn't start there. I have been a practicing parent advocate for the past almost 20 years. My journey began many, many years ago when my children were removed for neglect, as David referenced, but they were abused in foster care. To add another caveat to it, I am the only child of the Reverend Dr. Jackson. Both parents are deceased. My father was a Methodist minister. I come from a long line of ministers, and in my life, I was always called a PK, a preacher's kid. And all of those things did not make a difference when my children were being removed. At the time of the removal, my parents were not alive. And all of the many things that surrounded me in terms of strength and accolades, and the fact that I was 3-term PTA president and my daughter was on the honor roll, and all of those things did not make a difference when they were removing my children. I have 2 beautiful children. I have Sabra Inez, who is now an adult, doing extremely well, and my son Peyton Ulysses, who is going to college next year. But as I said, all they saw was a Black woman who was surviving a severely emotional abusive relationship, who had just lost her mother, who died at 89 years old. And when they said to me, well, what happened? What happened this time? I said, well, I had been neglecting myself. And so, having had, I'd say, about a 25-year history in human services as a caseworker and dealing in social services, they didn't look at any of those things. They didn't look at any of those things as a strength. They looked at those things, they said, I should have known better in terms of protecting my child or my children. So David referenced the time of children in care. My children were removed from my care and returned to my custody within 8 months, which is unprecedented. Usually children in foster care can stay in 12 months or more. So during my time of healing, I had to do so many things. I had to have my abuser arrested and then walk across the street to go to family court, because by the time everything came to a head, I was navigating 2 systems. So, I said to myself, I've always been an advocate, and I said to myself, well, what do I do with this energy? How do I heal this? And so there was one day I was on a family visit with my children, and I picked up a paper called the Nonprofit Press. And my parents always taught me to read everything, and I did that. And over in the corner was a a blurb that said, you know, has your family been affected by child welfare? Come and tell your story and meet other parents who have been affected by child welfare. I'm sorry, my other phone is ringing, forgive me. And so as a result of that, I was invited to come to a place called the Child Welfare Organizing Project, which is a nationally renowned movement of parents that was a professionally led, parent-led organization where, as David referenced, I was trained as a parent advocate, using my pain and turning it to power. So after staying there, I would say at least 7 years, being trained and then moving up to becoming a staff and overseeing the New York's version of the Parent Advocate Network. Then I had the opportunity to move on and become a parent advocate at a legal provider, but not forgetting the fact that how I had been impacted. I think for me to see over I would say over a decade of how the movement has changed is invigorating, but there is still work to be done. So in my new role, as I said, I oversee a group of parent advocates with New York City. And as I said, we help to implement policy practice and with the New York City child welfare system. But to go back to my roots, and as I said to David and Taliah, if my parents were alive, my narrative would be different because of the fact that due to the shame and hurt of what I had been through, I did not go back to the church to be surrounded by love and all of the things that I know that would help to support me in regaining custody. But in my work in the movement, the church is one of the intricate parts of helping parents and supporting parents in reunification. The church can be a site for visiting, for children visiting their parents. The church can be a place to find some of the services that they need, like housing and food and clothing and all of those, and therapeutic services. And those of us who subscribe to a much higher belief, there is a spiritual support that can be provided. So today, the work is not done. The work is not done, even though I have the privilege of being embedded in the infrastructure in the first time of having a leadership role as an impacted parent. I continue to do the work around the world. As David referenced, I am on the board for the International Parent Advocate Network. I have been around the world. I've had the privilege to speak in Beirut, Lebanon, many years ago, to the International Harm Reduction Conference. And sadly enough, saw so many parents who had the same story that I had, but spoke so many different languages. But the fact that I gave them a story of hope was very, very powerful for them. And thank God for Facebook, as many of you referenced. I still keep in contact with many of those people. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm hoping that my story will generate questions, and then there will be an exchange between us. Thank you for listening, and I'm going to pass this to Taliah.
Taliah has a child with hydrocephalus who was on her lap, and they were in the hospital because the child had some symptoms that may be problematic for the shunt that's in the child's head. So it's possible that there was some emergency that happened. That
yes, she seems to be offline completely at the moment.
So
Looking at it.
David, this is where we can start the exchange, because I'm so excited to talk to everyone on the call, because there seems to be a common spirit that is there that I'm very excited to hear about.
Right. Why don't we start with some questions, comments, and then when Taliah comes in, we can take a pause and questions.
I'm a veteran child welfare worker. I began in the child welfare system in Humboldt County, California in 1966 as the child welfare caseworker for the whole county. And we soon discovered that we needed to grow, for one. It was a big county. But the bottom line was that within 10 years, we had 15 people, 3 units. We had a child sexual abuse treatment program and reunification unit, et cetera, et cetera. But I discovered, what's that? I discovered there, I became sadly disillusioned with the system. But to get to some of my significant points, one of the things that I thought was a good move within the child welfare system was the creation of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And David, you're probably familiar with that. It was basically to give Native American families and communities more control over the process with a lot of protections. And I worked on res for a number of years under that program. Anyway, I want to get to a point that Sabra was talking about, this problem of being in an abusive relationship and trying to extract herself from that, and then losing her child through a child welfare procedure. I have a friend who went through a similar thing, and she did not have the kind of background and community support that Sabra had. And I stepped into her life as a friend at that point, and she got her child back and got herself out of the abusive relationship. But it brings me to my other point, which can be kind of a question. This young lady was also a foster child who was basically thrown to the wolves at age 18 with no support system, which I think is a common phenomenon. And I was becoming concerned about when I was working in the system, that when a child turns 18 in foster care, their life experience becomes very much that of a prisoner who gets back in the community with no support and no resources. And it's a kind of a devastating place to be in. And as with prisoners, foster children, graduated foster children, to borrow a term, turn to illegal activities to support themselves. And anyway, I'd like to kind of throw the question back to Sabra and to David about what you see going on, or what needs to go on about the kids who are graduating out of foster care.
Can we just hold on that for a minute, Paul, because Taliah's back online now, and it would be good to just hear what she has to say, and then just hold the table the question. So, Taliah, welcome back, and unmute, please.
Thank you. Sorry about that. It would be that your internet crashes just as you're in the middle of something. Well, thank you for having me here. My name's Taliah, and I am a mother of 8 children. And I grew up in the care system, and it's meant to be a system that takes care of children and makes everything better. And there's a very Disney-fied view, I fear, from the media. But my experience was not like that. It very much diminished my life opportunities. I was moved around through 32 foster care placements. I had very interrupted education. And there's a large stigma that goes with being a foster child. When I went to my high school guidance counselor and asked for help to apply to university, I was told foster kids don't go to college, and they wouldn't make me an appointment. Throughout my teens, I was a runaway. I've been homeless repeatedly. And thankfully, through hard work and having married my very best friend at 18 years old, I went to university in spite of that guidance counselor. Perhaps that was good advice, actually. It made me determined to prove her wrong. And we went to university and we built a family, and we bought a house, and we built a home and careers, and we have had a good life. I thought that child welfare was behind me. I pretended as though it was something that hadn't affected me. I was ashamed, and I thought if I worked hard enough, made the right choices, I'd be safe. My family wouldn't be affected by this system. When I had our 7th child, she was born with congenital kidney problems, and she was diagnosed with epilepsy. And this led to a consultant making a series of poor judgments, and the result was that our lives were ripped apart by a false accusation of child abuse. It led to our entire lives being evaluated, weighed, measured, and judged. And when they couldn't find fault with us, when every parenting assessment came back positive, they went to my childhood and they used that against me. I couldn't possibly be a good mother with the abuse I'd experienced. I couldn't possibly be a decent human being. You know what? They questioned every aspect of our life, you know, and my husband too. And once you're accused of being a bad parent, you're no longer a human being. Every decision I made in life no longer mattered. It took 360 days for them to declare that the abuse that my daughter had suffered, that they'd accused me of, was in fact medical negligence, and she was returned. We received justice, which most families never get. We're the lucky ones. But even after we lost our case, there was never any support. There was only judgment, punishment, and abuse from a system that seemed designed to overlook humanity and the best interests of our family as a whole. You know, with our child returned and our family reunited, you don't get the same child back that they took. You get this very traumatized child, along with the traumatized children that are at home, fearing that any day somebody could come and take them away. You're left with traumatized parents who are financially ruined and their identities are shattered. And we're the lucky ones. We got our child back. I didn't want to have to deal with this, but I started talking and started speaking up. And everywhere I look, I found people who said, it's happening to me. It's happened to my sister. I grew up in care too. I'm too scared to start a family of my own in case it happens to my children. And so I had to stand up and start fighting for my friends, for my neighbors, for my fellow parents, who I feel are my brothers and sisters by experience. And so I joined PAR, which is Parent Advocacy and Rights in Edinburgh, and joined IPAN and started working as a parent advocate. And parents around the world are all coming to us and saying the same thing. There is no support. There is only judgment. You know, I'm suffering these challenges and they seem to be amplified by this system. Recently, due to COVID, we held focus groups to see we're coping with the court systems as they moved online. And we found parents who are in extreme measures of poverty who weren't able to access the courts because they didn't have data to attend. They were attending court by phone and unable to see the people who were making critical decisions in their families' lives. They weren't able to ask for legal advice in the way that you would in court because they're on a phone and they can't say to their solicitor or their lawyer, I don't understand that. What was that question? Did you tell them this? What does that mean? These people were left traumatized and alone in their homes with no access to support. And as everything's moved online and we've had to learn new ways of managing to avoid COVID, a lot of parents' contact with their children have been cut. Now, this is an important aspect of the court process because if you don't have contact with your children, it becomes the new normal. And so because contact centers have closed, social workers are inferior. This is a big way that if you're looking for a way to help, opening your worship to contact so that parents and their children and families can spend time together will make a big difference. But all the timelines, everything is geared on a legal basis towards the best interests of the child. And we need to speed this up. We need to get this through. Adoption is seen as this golden solution. But with COVID, all those court timelines are still rushing forward, and all the steps that need to be done in advance to make the right decision aren't being done, and there's no just process to that. Parents who are meant to be attending substance abuse support groups that moved online, but they don't have data to attend them, and nobody asks them what help they need. Parents who need to have had a parenting assessment with 30 hours of contact with their children aren't able to do that because there is no contact centers. And yet the courts are still processing these judgments as though everything's running okay. I don't mean to sound terribly grim. It sounds like just a lot of negativity, and there are good reasons for a security system. We need to support our vulnerable, but we can do better. We can build a better, more supportive system, and part of that starts by asking the very people who are struggling, who are facing challenges, the people who this system is meant to support, asking them, what do you need? What would help you? And parents, and often the children too, aren't part of the conversation. My local council just developed, we're all in the paper announcing their glorious parenting board. This is going to be the dawn of a new era in child welfare. And there's not a parent on the board. It's for stakeholders and professionals to discuss what parents need, but they don't have a single parent. We can do better. And that starts by talking to the people who are impacted by this. Anyway, thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for putting up with my technical difficulties.
And I would like to thank both of you, Taliah and Sabra, for such amazing testimonies. It's really been incredible. If we could just hold on Phil's question for a while, because we have some other hands up. Rick, do you want to say what you wanted to say?
Sure. Thank you very much, all of you guys, for the informative information. And I know it's hard to share those kind of life experiences, so thank you very much for doing that. I would assume that there is a parallel in Europe and specifically in Scotland, but one of the things that has started to has come out is, and I wanted to see if there's a corollary with with getting into the foster care system, is that there is more policing and more police on a school campus that has a majority minority student population than there is usually in other schools, right? So for example, Black kids are 17% of the population in schools. The arrest rate is about 26 to almost 30%. So I wanted to see if you think that because of those institutional failures we have in the educational system, where we're kind of preparing with police to look for situations that maybe can be handled better by the counselors and resource people that happen to be in more of those affluent schools, if there's a corollary between kids, minority kids getting into the system a little bit earlier.
Hi, Rick. So David referenced the movement talking to schools of social work and medical colleges and so many other institutions. And because there has been a recognition of what you referenced, Rick, it has evolved over time because of the movement's efforts, but there is still work to be done, right? There is still work to be done. We still continue to go into the schools of social work and to the medical schools and to the Department of Education. I'm specifically looking at New York City and so many, talking to the city council and talking to the mayor's office and talking, but these things were not things that were looked at so many years ago. So yes, there is a correlation. Have we seen a reduction in calls? Yes. Is there still work to be done? Absolutely still work to be done. So I'm going to pause there.
Thank you. Carolfrances?
Yes, thank you. This is really amazing. I'm wondering if you know our Pacifica programmer, KPFK, Margaret Prescott. She talks about this a lot. And also, is Marian Wright Edelman's Children's Defense Committee part of your network? And who are the other organizations? And anybody in LA specifically?
We're not working directly with Marian Wright Edelman and the Children's Defense Fund, but they've done excellent work supporting children over the years. In fact, Marian Wright Edelman wrote a blurb in support of my book.
Oh,
He's a big fan of parent advocacy.
that's good.
There's a group in Los Angeles Defenders, I think it's called. I can get you the exact name of lawyers who are representing parents. I can send you the exact name after this presentation. But they have several ideas of how your group might actually be able to work with them around issues of visiting, which we can talk about later. Maybe using congregations as a place to have visiting. It's sometimes very difficult for parents to find places when the children are in care to visit with them. And Sabra has some ideas about that we'll talk about later. I wanted to say a couple things in regard to what Phil had talked about. The Indian Rights Act to give Native American communities greater control of the child welfare system has been a step forward, but it's still a terribly oppressive system. There's a tremendous disproportionality of Native Americans in the child welfare system, as there are extreme disproportionality of African Americans in the system. Child welfare was founded, one of the ways it was used was to destroy Native American cultures by having children placed in boarding schools so that they would have their culture stomped out of them. In Australia and Canada, it was very similar. The Aboriginal children, by law, in Australia from 1907 to the mid 1970s, if you were a mixed race child, by law, you could be removed from your family just because of that condition and placed into a residential placement to get the Aboriginal culture out of you. In Australia, that law was changed and there was an apology, but the system still functions the same way, whereas Aboriginal are a very small percentage of the population. I think something like 5%. They're 60% of the children in out-of-home care. So the functioning of the system has not changed, though the laws have changed.
Thank you. Dave Clennon, do you want to ask your question, and then I am interested, I must admit, to come back to Phil's question about the end of foster care. That's a biggie for me. Anyway, Dave, do you want to?
For 1 second, the outcomes for children who have been in foster care are dreadful. There was a recent study that 1 out of 4 children who leave the foster care system end up homeless within 2 years. And the other social indicators of suicide, imprisonment, teen pregnancy are equally as bad. With a system that's supposed to protect children, it does not. It harms many children. Some children are saved by it. I don't want to denigrate the entire foster parents, but as a social phenomenon, it is harmful to many, many children.
Yeah. Taliah has put her hand up, and is that in response to what we were just saying, Taliah? Okay.
I just wanted to chime in that was absolutely my experience. I was saved by the Child Welfare Service. My mother was 13 years old and was in no fit condition to care for me. But they didn't provide some idyllic, set of circumstances to grow up in either. And when I left care, it was more of a good riddance to you. There was no support. And forevermore, for the rest of my life, when my car breaks down, I have no dad to call. There was no grandparents there to celebrate at the hospital with the birth of my children. All those life events, I was severed from the ties of my family. I would argue perhaps the care system also failed my mother. What was a 13-year-old doing homeless with a baby? But, there's not a good transition to adulthood the way that we need to really reconsider. Sorry, go ahead, Dave.
Thank you very much, Taliah. Okay, Dave, over to you.
Well, thank you. I have a general question, and I also want to hear more from Phil. And I believe you're going back to Phil. My general question is the system, I assume, was originally designed to help children, and it's failing miserably. And I wonder how much that is a factor of the political priorities being so completely out of whack that the system is underfunded, and as well as having regulations that militate against good parents and vulnerable children. Is there any movement towards not only recreating a child welfare system that actually works for children, and is there a movement to make that a higher priority when it comes to state, local, and national budgets? Thank you.
I could try to answer that. I think because our social welfare system is so individualistic and so much blames parents and individuals for their problems rather than look at the social cause, we don't help families. We don't support families, unlike most countries throughout the world, which have universal health care, which have child allowances. We have none of that. And what we do create is a system of social control to pick up the pieces after those other systems have failed. We have a punitive system that blames parents. When a child is living in an apartment and there's no window gate on the window in the apartment they're renting and the child falls out, the mother is blamed rather than the owner of the building who's failed to provide the gate, is just one kind of example. There is a movement that's been developing, mostly led by parents in the United States, that goes from reforming child welfare to transforming to dismantling and to abolishing the child welfare system. People think there's an organization called Movement for Family Power, which is in favor of abolishing the child welfare system because it's like the police system, and that there is a connection between the police system and the child welfare system. In fact, among juveniles who are in juvenile detention, 60% have come from the foster care system or are in the foster care system now. It's just beginning. And the parent advocacy movement that we're part of is promoting that and supporting it. But it's got a long way to go. It's just the beginning. Parents have, as the Jews say, a still small voice. And we need to amplify that voice to really change the system. There are people who feel that child welfare system can't function because it's both an investigative and punishing system and supposed to be a system of social support. There are people who feel that you have to separate those two and have only a police function when there's real abuse and a support network, as there is in many European countries. In Germany, for example, if a child reported to be abused or neglected, they're not investigated by the state, but a social worker from a nonprofit agency goes out and see what helps the family needs. And if they can't help the family, then the social worker, reports it to protective services. We have a very different system of not assessing and supporting, but investigating and punishing.
I've got a couple more comments. I could probably talk a very long time about this, but I think after I was about 10 years into the program, I became convinced that the system was utterly broken. I had a coworker who kind of put it kind of bluntly and succinctly. He said, we're trying to do brain surgery with picks and shovels. And that we have blunt instruments. We don't know what the hell we're doing. And we are damaging children, probably more than we're helping. Of course, there's the kids who absolutely need to be in a foster care or substitute placement, but for the most part, we need to be focusing on helping families put themselves back together after trauma, and we're just not doing that.
Thank you. Bonnie Chollet.
I have 3 experiences with foster care, having been a teacher and a parent. But this was all taking place during the 70s. So I'm quite intrigued to find that you're involving the parents much more, and thrilled to hear of what is happening to support parents at this point. The first child I had was developmentally delayed, and he and his brother, who had a cleft palate, were referred to my preschool class for developmentally delayed children. The parents were both considered moderately retarded, and they could not apparently learn how to feed the child with the cleft palate. And so they were referred to me and then put in the foster care, and were passed around to 5 different foster homes before they were put up for adoption and were adopted. One of those children, who was developmentally delayed when I got him, has turned out to be a very well-known artist. And had he not been taken out of that home, probably would not have had the ability to get his career into focus now. The second one I also had was a selective mute child at age 3. It turned out that she had been severely sexually abused by her grandfather and brothers. And she was removed from the home, but only temporarily. And I never understood why they put her back in that home, but they did. And she turned out to be pregnant by the grandfather at age 13. that was not a successful situation. I do not think that those parents would have changed dramatically with help. But I do wonder, I've always wondered about the first parents of the cleft palate child and the speech delay child. If they had gotten the help that they needed in early intervention or something like that, perhaps that would have changed, but one never knows, obviously. And the last one is a personal situation. We adopted out of the foster care system an infant, and I hope that his life has become a positive one. But I am very happy to see parents involved now with an ability to advocate for themselves, because I think that's something that has been needed for a long time. So I thank you very much for your information and input today.
Thank you. Ruby, that's the last hand up. And if I could ask
no,
you
I've raised my hand. I've raised my hand from the phone. I've tried to.
Oh, who is that I'm speaking to?
This is Joe.
Joseph? Oh, no, I didn't know you had. Yeah, but can you both kind of just ask a question fairly succinctly then, because we're getting a little short on time, and part of the purpose of today was for our guests to talk about how we can get involved in this. And so we're a little short on time. I'm sorry, Joseph, I don't know how to see you raise from your hand from the phone. Anyway, Ruby, do you want to just?
Well, yes, I just thank each one of you in the different areas that you have, that you've come through your life and that you've worked through. But I look at things to be is the resolution. Is there a group like with each state department coming together to see what is working in their states regarding foster care or regarding some of these things? And the second thing is there a group regarding the Native Americans and everything of people coming out of their so-called classes of being, having to put down their race and being able to come back together and be proud? And then the third thing is there is organizations I know in Los Angeles regarding runaway and regarding people who are children, like teens and stuff, that come out and don't have a place to go. I can't think of the name now, but there is a place for them to come and, you know, after like foster homes, like instead of being homeless in the streets, and there's people that work with them and everything. I forget what it is. I know I have it. So those are three different areas. But, you know, we can work through this. And for the states that are involved and things are working, if they can just share with the other states or come together. So anyway, thank you all for the work you've done and your interest in your lives.
Okay. Joseph, and I apologize, I didn't know your hand was up, but if you can make it a quickie if possible, because it's 9:15 now, and we really want to hear what we can do from our guests. So over to you.
Yes,
Thank you.
it's possible. One of the things that we can do, we are actually doing without knowing it as ICUJP. I'll explain. Among the effects of abuse and neglect and disruptive experiences in childhood can be a kind of a numbing to the person's own experience and to the experience of others. And I think the underappreciation of the importance of all these things for children that is rampant in our society. Look at the massive disruption of the seizure of children, separation of families that we've protested as part of a fake solution to migration. And also generally the setup system that leaves families, particularly poverty, of course, racial minorities, but in such a terrible condition that it's almost a setup for the problems, as our speakers have explained. So I think we look at the context, we conclude that there's just a rampant spirit of numbing to a child's experience. And everything we do can be dedicated to that. Of course, that topic.
Thank you very much. And now I think it's back to our speakers to give us some ideas of things that that we can do. So I'll pass it back to you.
Maybe Taliah or Sabra can start with an idea or two, and then I'll
Sure.
add a few.
Sure. I always like being with Taliah and David. I consider David one of my mentors. I would not, and I want to say this publicly, I would not be in the role that I am in this historical role without his mentorship. So I need to be transparent about that, and I thank him for that. But one of the things that I want to go to Phil's question, and then I want to give some ideas, and then I'm going to pass it to Taliah and David. When my babies came home, they were not the same. As I said, they were removed from neglect and abuse.
Your voice disappeared, Sabra.
Okay, thank you. Can you all hear me now?
No, it's muted again. You're muted again.
Sorry. How about that? Is that good? I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So my children, as I said, they came home within 8 months, but they were not the same. And so after the shame and went away, I leaned back on my faith-based community, which is the community that I was raised in. And so my daughter, they did not come home the same, but I did not allow that to drive how their lives move forward. So my daughter recently graduated from college and works in finance on Wall Street and does her work through a social justice lens, which I'm very proud of. And my baby boy is on his way to college next year. And, he does his work, his internal work through a social justice lens. But one of the suggestions that I would give is because to the faith-based community is to make a safe space for families. I think someone referenced a visiting site, a place where families could possibly get counseling or some of the services that are needed. The movement often says we don't need a cookie cutter service plan to regain custody. I knew the services that I needed. I knew that I needed to have my abuser arrested, and he was arrested in family court. I knew the other healing processes, which someone may call a service plan, that I needed. And so what I would encourage the faith-based community, as I hear so many wonderful opportunities on those phone calls, is to make themselves available to the families who have been impacted by child welfare, and to continue to that partnership with your social services agencies or your child welfare agencies and your city government and so forth and so on, because they are so intertwined. They are so intertwined. So I'm going to pause right there because I'm looking at the time. I'm going to pass it to Taliah.
Before Taliah speaks, there's a group in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Dependency Lawyers, that have said they would be happy to facilitate having parents who have children in foster care work with you through your congregations to use your spaces to have parents and their children visit together, if that's something you wanted to do, and I'd be happy to make the connection. Taliah?
To build on what Sabra and David have said, they've talked about potentially offering places where families can actually come together and spend time together through whatever process and challenges they might be facing. And to build on what Sabra said, one of the best things I think I could ask you to do is to do in the same way as IPAN has done, as David has done for Sabra and I, is to provide opportunities for people who are going through extreme trauma to be human again. I wouldn't be in this role without David. How many employers would let you do what is most important and dear to your heart while juggling 8 children, no matter what hiccups and technical issues and locations and difficulties, and providing those opportunities for people to achieve their hopes and dreams and goals, and in order to allow them to have opportunities to help other people going through the same thing, giving them those spaces to do that. If you can provide that, it'll multiply the good that's being done. Thank you.
I think having parents come and speak in your congregation so that people will hear the stories of Taliah and Sabra and the dozens and dozens of other parents that the International Parent Advocacy Network is working with. One of the principles in sociology is that contact reduces prejudice. And I think there's a lot of prejudice towards parents who have had children removed. Having them speak in your congregations, I think, will go a long way to begin to change people's views about who is involved in the child welfare system. Another suggestion is that lots of child welfare is administered by religious agencies. They're funded by the government, but the services, the foster care beds, are run by religious agencies, and they're not always on the side of the angels. In New York City, the Catholic, the Jewish, and the Protestant agencies refused to take Black children for many, many years. There was a Wilder lawsuit called the Wilder lawsuit to get those agencies to take Black children. Through your networks, contact religious social service agencies to get them to have the voice of parents involved in their programming, so that they would change how they orient as well. And the final suggestion, I think we're running out of time, is that the International Parent Advocacy Network has lots of needs for help. We have a newsletter, we have a communications committee. You have technical skills that could be helpful to us. We have a fundraising committee, we have all sorts of things. And if you wanted to be involved in supporting this movement, please get in touch and we'll find lots of ways that you can help.
Fidel, do you have something you wish to say?
No, I'm sorry if I distracted. Since the beginning, the little girl wanted to say something, and she was disappearing in the camera. She's saying hello to her. But anyway, I now that I am talking, I appreciate it very much. I am also a father, 3 children. They grow up beautifully. They're very well, you know, but I know that the system is corrupted. Thank you.
Thank you. And Steve, I see you have your hand up.
Thank you. Dave, several of us, well, we live in California. This organization is based in LA. Someone made the point of blaming individuals when it's really a systemic problem. Are you aware of any movements in the California legislature to address any of the issues we're talking about today, and anything that ICUJP could get behind?
I don't know about the California situation specifically. If you want to get behind reform, I would suggest you contact the Los Angeles dependency lawyers. I met with the head of that program before this talk to find out what's going on. He represents parents in these proceedings, and there are many things that he knows about that I'm not aware of. I'd be happy to make that connection. We should communicate after this.
Yes, offline, maybe you and I can do a short resource page based on today's program, and then we'll push that out to our list and all our related lists.
Great, terrific.
Great, thank you so much.